This is Dickerson Bay. I've lived here for a long time, since the early 60s when I first started Gulf Specimen. There's many, many beautiful things here, and lots of life abounding everywhere, and it's just a great chance to share it with everybody and talk about the intricacies.
So we're hoping that this little production will be able to share with you some of the things as we see them here that might not be so obvious to somebody just driving through. So these are mostly yellow. Sometimes they come in all different colors. Here's one with stripes. It's kind of a bluish black color with little stripes on it. Here's a bright yellow one. You know, in past years, and when the early Spanish came to Florida, they used, these shells were so common that they would actually make a form of building material called coquina rock, and they actually built the fort at St. Augustine, I think, is built with that kind of rock. I think it's called tab.
So that's how you pick up a ghost crab, by the top of the shell. Oops. Got me right there. These claws are extremely sharp, and they're made for tearing and ripping and cutting. And if they ever get hold of your finger, it's worse than any blue crab.
Yes, looks like all the next start digging pretty soon there. Even the shells are in patches. See that? Look, there's another patch. There's a few in here. See, you've got a couple coming up. But, they're just really patchy. But that's the art of finding coquinas. Whoops, there they all go. They should start to bury back down in the sand too after the wave. There goes one right there.
There's a bunch of them right here.
A beach is probably one of the most specialized parts of the coastal ocean. It has maybe the fewest number of species of most marine habitats, but the species that are here, like coquina clams and mole crabs and ghost crabs, are all extremely specialized for this intertidal environment and for the harshness of the wave action and the sand scour that they're always going to deal with in this environment. So it's a very special place to come to a sandy beach. It's not just beach balls. The surf zone of a beach like this is a nursery area. A lot of fish come in here as juveniles and actually grow here when they're in their smallest stages. Things like tonguefish, which are a type of little flounder, and silversides, pompano, weakfish, things like that. So that's why you have surf fishermen. Surf fishermen know that the larger fish will come in sometimes and feed on animals that are disoriented if there's a lot of wave action. Check what we got. These are coquinas, and this is one of the most abundant small clams that only lives in the surf zone of a sandy beach like this, and it has to have pretty clean water. There are actually several species here together. They look almost alike, except one grows bigger than the other one does. The Latin names are Donax variabilis and Donax parvula. These are really important animals, not only the most visible ones, but they're one of the major food sources. These are food for a lot of different crabs, especially ghost crabs. When you see ghost crabs on the beach at night, they're usually walking down into the surf zone and they're feeding quite heavily on these. Also, blue crabs and spotted surf crabs like Ovalipes and Irenaeus all eat these things. They actually are very clever at doing what they do. There aren't many animals that can live in the surf zone like this because it's so dynamic, because the sand is always swirling around and the waves are too. There's actually a lot of stuff going on in the surf zone of a barrier island. We come down in the middle of the day and sit on our beach blanket and go out and swim, and it doesn't look like there's much there, but there's really a lot going on. You just need to come at night, and you would think just walking across the sand. One of the things people see on a beach is shorebirds. People like to walk and see the shorebirds. Most of those are feeding on a falling tide, on animals that are being exposed, that are down in the sand. The crustaceans, the amphipods, The polychaete worms, things like that are what they're eating. I mean, maybe they're eating little juvenile coquinas, but once the clams get to be about this big, I think they're too big for most of the shorebirds, but they may be eating some of the smaller ones. These clams themselves feed on plankton out of the water. They're filter feeders. Like many animals in the ocean, they actually pump water through their bodies and filter the microscopic organisms in the plankton out. That's why they have to be in the surf zone. Every wave that comes in is a new supply of food for them, and they're highly adapted for getting that food out of the water. These were live clams. They're empty shells now. It's getting towards fall of the year, and they're at the end of their annual life cycle, and they complete their life cycle and die off just like anything else. They're not all consumed by predators. Some of them just die at the end of the life cycle, and so they've spent their year filtering and marching up and down the beach and living the life of a coquina, and now the shells are what's left, and some of them might end up picked up and put on somebody's porch at a beach house. Others will just break down and the shells will eventually dissolve, and the calcium will go back into the sand and into the water, and then next year it'll be available for our new baby clams to grow their shells. They'll absorb the calcium out of the water and make their shells, and the whole cycle will start all over again with next year's generation of coquinas. One of the most important animals out here, this is the sea urchin. It's called Lidocynus variegatus, and it is a grazer out here. It feeds on the blades of turtle grass, and it feeds on dead pieces of seagrass. This is a predatory snail. It eats other mollusks, and it in turn is eaten by some of the larger snails out here, like the left-handed whelk and the horse conch.
I wasn't aware of how diverse this environment actually is. She compared it to a coral reef, and it's kind of odd how the more diverse it is, it also seems incredibly fragile the environment is as well.
So if you shuffle your feet, then the stingray, if you bump into it, it'll just swim away.
What about you're on ice?
Yeah, they have no desire to sting anybody. They just don't like getting stepped on.
It's exciting. I don't know, I was kind of scared at first because of the sea urchins, but the more you got comfortable with it, the more fun it was. You could spot stuff easily, and we actually studied briefly about it, and we could pick out what, families and phylums they were in.
And what we're doing is we're towing this really small mesh net through a shoalgrass bed and capturing a lot of grass detritus and hopefully whatever small organisms are in a seagrass bed that you don't see snorkeling. And there might be grass shrimp, there might be several species of what are called Caridean shrimp, there might be mysid shrimp in here, there might be small little snails. There's certainly a lot of drift algae, and the drift algae will be most of what we'll haul out of there, but it can be full of little crustaceans, so we will see. The operculum, this horny plate. This is St. Joe Bay in North Florida. This is one of the best areas for seagrass beds in the area. North Florida has some of the largest seagrass beds in the world, but most of them are a little bit harder to get to than these. These you can just walk right out. If you look out there, you see the difference in the color of the water. The very light stuff is a sandbar, and all that darker water beyond it is shoalgrass. And then out beyond that, even further out, where you can just barely see the streaks of the sandbars, is turtle grass. And when you go out into that water, it's only about waist deep, it's warm, you can snorkel around. If you get upset about something, you can stand up and walk home. It's very simple to do logistically, and it's clear water, so what you have here are rooted flowering plants on the seafloor. And those rooted flowering plants are just chock full of marine animals. We've caught lots and lots of shrimp, lots and lots of clams, snails, sea squirts, tunicates, starfish, sea urchins. It's just like an underwater garden of marine life. There are not many places you can so easily go to and just see the huge diversity of marine life that's really out there. is called a flat-clawed hermit crab. This looks like, this is one of my favorite places to bring students. We were really lucky to have some students here today. And typically when you take a group of people out there, they snorkel around for an hour or so, and it's a life-changing experience for them because nobody has seen that kind of stuff so easily before, or so many things that are completely different from anything they'd ever seen before outside of an aquarium. So here you get to see it in its natural environment. And it's beautiful too. The sunlight on the water and the green grass, and particularly when the water is really clear, it's just one of the most gorgeous places to be.
Yeah, it was really neat because we had our goggles so we could see everything under the water and it was perfectly clear, and then we got to borrow some scuba gear for some of the guys, so it was really cool.
A seagrass bed is sometimes part of an estuary where the water is lower in salinity. It's sometimes found in higher salinity environments. Actually, St. Joe Bay is one of the few bays in the North Florida area that's not estuarine because it doesn't have big river drainage. So the salinity stays high and it stays stable, the water stays clearer, and that's where you get seagrass. But it does still need fresh water coming in like any other estuary because there's so much evaporation on these shallow grass beds that if you don't have more fresh water coming in to replace it, it gets hypersaline, and then a lot of animals can't live here. So it's also a nursery habitat, just like a salt marsh. It is the place where you find the juveniles. The juveniles of the pink shrimp are here. When they grow up and they move offshore into deeper waters, that's where they're caught. But the little guys that are about this big, this big, this big, they're out here in the seagrass bed. So just like a salt marsh in an estuary, the seagrass bed is nursery habitat for scallops. It's also nursery habitat for gag grouper. If you go offshore fishing for gag grouper, your gag grouper started off as a little fish about this big in here that was bright green so that it would blend in with the blades of seagrass. So they use that telson or tail to protect itself like it's doing here. It thinks it's got a bird after it. If it thinks, however horseshoe crabs think, I don't know. And then the other thing it does with it is it pushes, it's trying to push against the bottom now to flip itself over. So maybe we can see it if we don't stir up any more mud here, but and when it hits the bottom, you'll see how it's using the tail now and it flipped itself right over and off it goes.
We were just really lucky to have the opportunity and be in the right place at the right time. It was a great experience.
We've got a couple of scallops. See, this tulip shell is busy trying to eat that scallop right now. Hold it up there. So it will. There's no end to the wonders of a seagrass bed.
These are crabs that we call peeler crabs, and they're a certain kind of crab that have a V on the bottom, and they'll shed into a female. So these are immature crabs. They have different stages. They'll change colors, if you'll see the color on that one. And this is actually a crack crab, so it'll be shedding in about at least 2 days. This will become a soft shell. As they shed, if you look, this crab is a female, and it is soft. It's totally flexible, everything on it, and it actually came out of this shell. My husband thinks I'm crazy. I see crabs every day, and I still love them. I go to a restaurant, and that's what I eat is crab. This is my other business, actually. It is Hutton Seafood and More, and we cook soft shell crabs. I'm putting some on the grill, and then I'm gonna fry some. We lightly salt them, and this is flour and cornmeal mix. It's about half and half. We don't put anything on them, just take them straight out of the bowl and put them in flour. And then put them in the fryer. Very hard work in all of it. So in any aspect, whether you catch it, shed them, clean them, cook them, it's all a big job, but it's well worth it.
Over the years, this young lady and her husband Ray have been invaluable to Gulf Specimen Marine Lab and to scientific research. Much that has been learned about the behavior of blue crabs, the molting, how they change shells, the biochemistry, all come from crabs that she provides, that we provide to places like Auburn University and Massachusetts, MIT, and other places like that. And we have to have the crabs in really good shape, and they take the best care of the crabs. They're always lively. They're always that one little extra step of making the difference, of just being sort of impeccable versus people that just don't care and they just throw it in there.
This is the food factory of the ocean. This is the nursery habitat of the ocean. This is the salt marsh.
And if you go into this wonderful environment with all this good rich mud, with all its organics and all the food that it offers for the estuary and all the shrimp that it feeds and the worms and all that sort of thing, well, you have to get in their own terms sometimes.
We're out here in a North Florida salt marsh at low tide, which means it's a little tougher to get around, because the North Florida salt marsh is all about a few species of plants that grow in soft sediments. It can be sand, it can be mud. Here it's a mixture of both. There are not many places in the world where you have such huge salt marshes so close to settlement where people can go and see it. This area remained undeveloped because in the 1800s, if you came in by sailing ship, the water offshore in the Gulf here was so shallow that you couldn't navigate. If you came down by mule and wagon, you hit swamp after swamp after swamp, and then you hit these broad expanses of marsh that you couldn't travel through. So these marshes were an enormous barrier to human movement. And there's no good soil in those forests up there. It's all limestone and wetland and swamp cabbage. It's not farmable. So before there were highways and supermarkets, you had to live where you could grow your own food. You can't grow food here. So this coast was left to the fishermen and the eagles and the manatees and the sea turtles and the mullet. And as a result, we still have a wilderness coast here today. Depending on where you are in the country, a marsh may be mostly needle rush, it may be mostly cordgrass. If you go a little bit further south, marshes like this have black mangroves in them, and if you go further south still, the marshes are replaced with black mangrove and white and red mangrove, which replace the marsh in terms of being the plants that live in the intertidal zone where there's not much wave action. Now, you don't find this in a place where there's a lot of wave action on the shore, deep water, big waves. You find sandy beaches. But here, offshore from this marsh, it's shallow, a long ways out, and that means there's not a lot of wave action coming in. When the tide comes in here, it comes in like a sheet flow, and it just gently rises and then it gently falls. That allows these rooted plants to maintain their dominance here. When you walk out here, this is called a salt flat, and this is at the high end of the marsh. We were down at the coast at the seaward end of the marsh, and we were out in the middle of the marsh in the creek. But up here, right next to the forest, that line of trees is like a shoreline in its own right, and that is the edge of the intertidal zone. Where the trees stop, that's where the tidal influence stops. So when the tides come in, there are different heights of tides at different times of the month. Some high tides are higher than others. The highest high tides make it all the way up to the tree line, and they make it up into these areas that are open. And the reason they're open and there's no grass here is because water comes in here on high tide. It doesn't all flush out. It tends to evaporate, particularly during the summertime. So it evaporates. It's a natural salt flat. It leaves behind very high concentrations of salt in the soil. The soil here gets so salty that even the salt marsh, cordgrass, and needle rush marsh can't take it. So you get this barren area, and the plants that are here are called Batis and Salicornia. These are succulents. These little plants have succulent leaves just like desert plants do. In fact, they're related to the same plants that would grow out in the deserts of the Southwest. The succulent crunchy tissue is similar to what a cactus has, and it's an adaptation to dealing with the high salt concentration. They're the only ones that can make it up here with the extremely high salt. But these open flat areas are really important. This is where you'll find wood storks and egrets and herons and white ibis, and sometimes spoonbills come in up here. Sometimes we see white pelicans. They don't like to sit out there in that thick marsh, so when the birds are coming through, if they need a resting area, they'll use these salt flats. The other nice thing about the salt flat is that the deer come out to these marsh hammocks. You see these tree islands out here. These are spots in the marsh where the underlying limestone is just a tiny bit higher, just enough so that it's above the highest high tides, and then you get terrestrial vegetation on it, slash pine and palmetto and cabbage palm and so forth. And the deer go all through out here at night, and they create little deer trails that go from salt flat to salt flat. They don't want to get stuck in the mud any more than we do. So it's possible, it doesn't look like you could walk through this, but you can walk all through these marshes. You just find the salt flats, you find the deer trails, and off you go. So. This is pretty out here.
Huh?
This is pretty out here.
Yeah.
These are grass shrimp. These don't get any bigger than they are now, but these are a major food resource for the larger fish, the crabs, all the wading birds that you see out here in a marsh. This is a major food source for them. The grass shrimp live here throughout their life cycle, but the blue crabs come in here and use this as a nursery area. So these are juvenile crabs. There are also killifish in here. These little fish also live in the marsh throughout their life cycle. So this is an adult. There are several more down here. These killifish are also an important food resource for the larger fish in the marsh and the birds that you find. Bird watchers come out here to look at the egrets and the ibis and so forth. The birds are here because there's this unconcentrated source of food here with the fish and the shrimp. If there were a nuclear war, and I somehow survived the initial impact and had to survive, the best way to survive would be to simply have a net like this and be in a salt marsh, and you would never starve because the protein out here is just enormous.
All the way out this way here.
It's mud. Mud is good stuff. Now it looks nasty, looks slimy, but what you're looking at here is a treasure trove of cleanliness. This is binding heavy metals, toxins, pollutants, things that run off from the upland. It pulls it into the mud. This can even heal oil, and this can even heal pollutants of all sorts because of the seething masses of bacteria that are in this mud. This mud